If you chose discipline over distractions, clarity over chaos, and self-respect over approval, you may have already noticed something painful happening quietly around you. People stop calling as often. Invitations fade. Conversations that once flowed now feel forced or hollow. And the silence around you grows heavier than any noise you used to drown in. And this is the point where most people panic, because humans are wired to fear disconnection more than failure, so they assume something is wrong with them. But the silent samurai understood something most never will, that growth creates distance, not because you became worse, but because you became different. And difference exposes gaps that comfort once hid. Because every relationship is built on a shared identity, shared habits, shared tolerance for stagnation. And when your identity shifts, the old contracts silently expire, not through hatred, but through incompatibility. Because the version of you that laughed at distractions, tolerated mediocrity, or numbed discomfort is no longer present to sustain the dynamic. And this is where people misunderstand your silence as arrogance, your discipline as judgment, and your withdrawal as rejection. Because when someone evolves, it forces those around them to subconsciously confront their own avoidance. And most people do not resent your growth directly. They resent how your presence reminds them of the version of themselves they postponed becoming. So they resist your evolution not with words, but with distance, subtle guilt, jokes that minimize your effort, emotional pullback, or pressure to come back to how you used to be. And when you don't, when you stay quiet and keep walking, the separation feels personal, but it isn't. It is structural. Because growth naturally dismantles bonds that were only strong under shared limitation. And the silent samurai never begged people to adjust to his elevation, because he understood that forcing connection during identity change weakens both sides. And this leads to the second truth most avoid, the difference between loneliness and solitude. Because loneliness is not simply being without people. Loneliness is being without yourself. It is when silence becomes unbearable because there is nothing stable inside to sit with, while solitude is the opposite. It is the presence of self so complete that silence becomes neutral, even nourishing. And modern society confuses the two because it teaches people to outsource identity to noise, messages, feeds, opinions, constant stimulation. So when silence arrives, it feels like death. Not because they're alone, but because the noise was propping up a hollow sense of self. And this is why most fear silence, because silence removes distractions, and without distractions, unresolved thoughts surface, insecurities speak, questions demand answers, and instead of meeting themselves, people drown that moment in content, conversations, validation, or chaos, while the samurai did the opposite. He stepped into the quiet intentionally, because warriors throughout history isolated themselves not to escape life, but to sharpen perception. Because noise dulls awareness, crowds blur judgment, and constant interaction fractures focus. And when you reduce external input, you amplify internal clarity, which is why the lone samurai path begins with walking alone, not as rebellion, but as refinement. Because solitude is not emptiness, it is pressure, and pressure reveals structure. And this phase feels uncomfortable because your nervous system is rewiring. It was trained to measure safety by presence, approval, feedback, and reaction, and now it is forced to source stability internally. And during this stage, you notice yourself pulling back naturally, texting less, explaining less, reacting slower, not because you are colder, but because you are no longer leaking energy into unnecessary exchanges. And this inward shift creates a vacuum externally that others interpret as abandonment. But to the samurai, it is conservation, because power does not come from being available to everyone, it comes from being aligned with yourself. And this is why silence is misunderstood, because most people speak to be seen, but when you no longer need to perform your thoughts aloud to feel real, your quiet becomes unsettling to those still dependent on noise. And this is the unspoken initiation that filters the weak from the disciplined, because the world celebrates loud success, but rarely shows the silent incubation that precedes it. And every meaningful transformation passes through a lonely corridor where old mirrors disappear and new ones haven't formed yet. And this is where people either retreat back into familiarity or keep walking into the unknown version of themselves. And the samurai knew that turning back at this point meant trading long-term authority for short-term comfort. So he accepted the stillness, not emotionally detached, but strategically grounded, understanding that solitude is not the absence of connection, it is the recalibration of connection, a clearing of internal noise before deeper alignment. And if this phase hurts, it is because the old you is losing leverage, the external voices are fading, and the internal compass is learning to stand on its own. And that discomfort is not danger, it is confirmation that something is restructuring beneath the surface, because power does not announce itself loudly in the beginning. It builds quietly while you walk alone. And this is only the first stage of the lone samurai path, where distance appears, silence grows, and the weak return to crowds, while the disciplined stay and begin to hear their own voice clearly for the first time.
The lone samurai path does not announce itself with clarity or confidence at first. It begins quietly with the withdrawal phase, a phase so subtle that many mistake it for laziness or burnout. But in truth, it is the nervous system instinctively pulling inward to protect energy. And during this phase, you notice yourself responding slower, speaking less, canceling plans without guilt, not because you dislike people, but because your tolerance for shallow exchange has disappeared. And this reduction creates pressure, because when your external world gets quieter, your internal world gets louder. Thoughts surface that were previously drowned out. Emotions you avoided now sit beside you, and the discomfort confuses many because they think growth should feel empowering immediately. But the samurai understood that power begins as friction, not ease. And this phase is marked by emotional confusion because your identity is transitioning before your environment catches up. And humans crave coherence, so when your internal values no longer match your external habits, tension forms. And this is where invitations fade, not always intentionally, but because people sense your disengagement without understanding its purpose. And as the withdrawal phase stabilizes, it flows directly into the misunderstood phase, which is where the silence becomes visible to others, and suddenly they react, labeling you distant, cold, selfish, changed, or not yourself anymore. And this stage is especially dangerous because emotional manipulation tends to appear here. Subtle guilt wrapped as concern, statements like, "You're different now," "You never come around," "Remember when you used to," all designed to pull you back into the version of yourself that felt predictable to them. And the samurai never reacted emotionally to this pressure because he understood a core rule: explain yourself once with calm clarity, and if misunderstood, withdraw further. Because over-explaining is not communication, it is negotiation of identity. And every time you justify your growth to someone committed to misunderstanding you, you weaken your internal authority. And this phase hurts because being misjudged by people who once mattered creates internal conflict. The mind wants to correct the narrative, to defend intention, to regain alignment. But this urge is ego-based, not truth-based. And the samurai trains himself to resist it, knowing that character is reviewed through consistency, not explanation. And when he does not bend, the pressure escalates into the doubt phase, the most psychologically demanding stage of the path, because doubt does not come from others now, it comes from inside, late at night, in silence, when questions surface without distraction. Questions like, am I doing the right thing? Did I isolate myself unnecessarily? What if this costs me meaningful connection? And these questions are dangerous because they sound reasonable, and doubt does not shout, it whispers, wearing the mask of logic, nostalgia, and fear of missing out. And this is where temptation appears to revert,
not fully, but just enough. To send a message, attend an event, soften your standards, lower your discipline, because the mind searches for relief from uncertainty. But the samurai recognizes this phase as a test, not of strength, but of resolve. Because discipline without witnesses feels pointless to the untrained, but to the warrior it is sacred. And the doubt phase exists to separate those who are serious about transformation from those who only wanted its aesthetic. Because anyone can change when praised, few can persist when unseen. And this stage attacks you through comparison, watching others socialize freely, relax without consequence, laugh without restraint, while you sit alone, sharpening habits no one applauds. And the danger is not missing out on them, it is abandoning yourself to avoid discomfort. And the samurai refuses, understanding that solitude is not meant to be entertaining, it is meant to be formative. And every time you remain aligned instead of reactive, something subtle shifts. Your nervous system stabilizes, your thoughts grow quieter, your discipline becomes automatic instead of forced. And without realizing it, you enter the deepening phase, where effort decreases and focus increases, because the internal resistance fades, routines stabilize, energy recovers, mental clarity sharpens, and you no longer feel the urge to fill silence, because silence starts feeling like home, not emptiness. And this is where your presence changes. Even in stillness, you become grounded, slower to speak, quicker to see, and people begin to sense something different about you without being able to articulate it, because when a man is no longer internally fragmented, his energy becomes coherent, and coherence feels like authority without effort. And this sets the stage for the final shift, the power phase, which does not arrive with celebration, but with calm certainty. Because self-trust replaces validation, you no longer need reassurance. Compliments bounce off without inflating ego. Criticism lands without destabilizing identity. And your silence carries weight because it is no longer defensive, it is deliberate. And people feel it, not because you dominate space, but because you are not seeking anything from it. And this is why solitude was never punishment, it was training. Because noise keeps most people reactive, fragmented, and dependent. But silence forces integration, and integration creates power. And those who fail this path fail not because they lacked potential, but because they mistook loneliness as evidence of failure instead of evidence of transition. They numbed the quiet with distraction, chased old validation, and retreated just before meeting themselves fully. And the lone samurai never makes that mistake, because he knows the version of himself forged here cannot be shaken later. And what comes next is not isolation, but a higher form of connection built on presence instead of performance, strength instead of need. And that is when silence stops feeling heavy.
The silent samurai never confused isolation with abandonment, because he understood solitude as sharpening, not suffering, and long before modern psychology named it, warriors practiced this instinctively, withdrawing from noise, crowds, and unnecessary interaction before battle, because clarity is dulled by constant input, and perception sharpens only when the mind is still. And this is why ancient warriors trained alone, not because they rejected others, but because distraction fractures awareness, and awareness is survival. And the modern world has inverted this logic, glorifying constant availability, constant expression, constant stimulation, which is why most people are mentally exhausted yet internally underdeveloped. Because noise creates the illusion of fullness while preventing depth. And the samurai saw this clearly, recognizing that when every moment is filled with sound, the mind never integrates experience, it only reacts. And reaction is weakness, not because emotion is bad, but because unexamined emotion controls behavior. And solitude interrupts that cycle, because in silence you are forced to face discomfort without anesthetic. And most fail this stage because they misinterpret the signal, believing loneliness means something went wrong, when in truth it means something real finally began. So they rush back to comfort, scroll their way out of stillness, speak when they should listen, and announce progress before it stabilizes, which drains momentum, because power accumulates quietly. And this is why solitude must be used correctly, not as avoidance, but as training, by walking alone daily, without stimulation, no music, no phone, letting thoughts rise and fall until they lose urgency. By eating alone sometimes, without distraction, learning to sit with yourself without outsourcing presence. By training without an audience, resisting the urge to perform discipline for validation. And by building without announcing, letting results speak later instead of prematurely dissipating energy through explanation. Because silence is not passive, it is active containment, and what you contain shapes you. And this aligns directly with Stoic discipline, especially the idea of withdrawing into yourself, building an inner citadel that does not rely on external permission for peace. Because when your sense of stability depends on reaction, it can be taken. But when it depends on internal alignment, it becomes untouchable. And this inner citadel is not emotional numbness, it is emotional sovereignty, the ability to feel without being led, to hear criticism without collapsing, to experience loss without identity fracture. And solitude is the ground where that sovereignty is built, brick by brick, habit by habit, breath by breath. And the silent samurai never sought isolation deliberately, but he accepted it without resentment when it arrived, because he understood that growth reorganizes life before it beautifies it, and that walking alone sharpens discernment, discipline, and inner authority, while crowds provide comfort but rarely provide growth. And the moment you stop chasing approval, your silence begins to speak louder than any justification ever could, because absence of need changes posture, pace, and presence, and people feel it without explanation. And those meant to walk with you will find you later, not during construction, but after structure has formed, when your presence is stable enough to lead without effort. And until that moment arrives, you walk alone without bitterness, train without applause, and grow without explanation, not as punishment, but as preparation. Because solitude is not the absence of connection, it is the cultivation of depth. And depth attracts alignment naturally. And when silence becomes power, you no longer fear being alone, because you have become your own strongest ally, grounded, disciplined, and unshaken. And from that place, connection is no longer a requirement for stability, but a choice made from strength. And this is the path of the lone samurai, not loud, not rushed, not crowded, but deliberate, sharpened, and unstoppable.
The silent samurai's transformation did not end at power. That was merely the threshold into a deeper realm where solitude no longer served as a shield, but as a forge for mastery. Because once a person stabilizes internally, the real work begins, shaping that inner strength into a weaponized form of calm that influences everything it touches. And this is where the samurai applied three ancient mental models that modern people desperately need but rarely understand, beginning with the principle of internal stillness, the idea that external chaos cannot disturb a mind that does not participate in it, meaning that calm is not a mood but a trained stance, a posture of awareness where emotion arises but does not command, thought appears but does not dictate, and silence becomes not an escape, but the operating system for decision-making. And the samurai refined this by practicing deliberate withdrawal before every major action, stepping into solitude not to isolate, but to clarify, because clarity is a blade that dulls the moment you hand it to others for permission. And the second model, the art of invisible discipline, states that true strength is not measured by what you showcase, but by what you sustain in the dark. Because anyone can be disciplined publicly, but the samurai trained when no one watched, corrected himself when no one criticized, and held standards when no one rewarded them, understanding that applause weakens discipline by redirecting effort toward performance rather than purpose. And the third model, the law of returned focus, teaches that every distraction paid for with attention is purchased with fragments of your future. because the samurai believed attention is the purest currency of power, and wherever it flows, energy follows, identity adapts, and destiny shapes itself, which is why solitude was not merely a physical state, but a practice of reclaiming focus from the world, gathering it, sharpening it, and directing it like an arrow rather than scattering it like dust. And once these models stabilize, the samurai enters a phase of integration, where solitude becomes ritualistic rather than reactive, beginning with the morning of no noise, where he wakes without input, no messages, no opinions, no stimulation, allowing consciousness to rise naturally without interference, because the first thoughts of the day set the tone for the mind. And then comes the walk of intention, a silent 10 to 20-minute walk without headphones or distraction, not for fitness, but for alignment, letting the mind settle, letting emotions dissolve, letting thoughts pass without attachment until the internal sea becomes still. And only then does he enter the work segment, which the samurai approaches with a warrior's precision, choosing one target, one task, one objective, because scattering effort weakens power, while concentrated effort shapes it. And throughout the day he practices the ritual of micro-withdrawals, brief moments where he steps back into inner silence, 30 seconds here, 1 minute there, resetting attention, reclaiming focus, and ensuring he never becomes mentally entangled with noise. And the samurai also practices the discipline of non-announcement, building quietly, progressing privately, allowing momentum to accumulate without leaking energy through explanation, understanding that when intentions are spoken prematurely, the mind rewards itself for the announcement instead of the accomplishment, weakening the drive to execute. And perhaps the most powerful ritual of all is the night of reckoning, where the samurai sits alone with the day, reviewing choices, errors, reactions, victories, and emotions, not with judgment, but with awareness. Because self-awareness without defensiveness is transformation. And every night he sharpens the blade of self-understanding, so the next day he cuts through life more cleanly. And this rhythm, maintained consistently, produces a psychological shift few ever experience, where solitude no longer feels like an exception, but like the native environment of growth. And from this grounded state, the samurai develops a presence so steady that people instinctively soften around him, not because he demands respect, but because he embodies it. And his silence becomes not emptiness, but gravitational pull. And his calm becomes contagious, and the world begins to respond differently, because people feel safe around someone who is not controlled by noise, and inspired by someone who does not chase validation, and grounded by someone who does not need to dominate to be felt. And this is the paradox of the lone samurai path. Walking alone makes you powerful, but becoming powerful draws people to you, not for entertainment or distraction, but for alignment, because depth attracts depth, clarity attracts clarity, and presence attracts presence. And this is the level where the samurai stops seeking connection and starts choosing it, not out of necessity, but out of discernment. And from this place, relationships become cleaner, decisions become sharper, and life becomes quieter, not because there is less happening, but because you have mastered the art of not internalizing what does not belong to you. And this shift marks the beginning of leadership, not the loud leadership of commands and visibility, but the silent leadership of example, where your discipline becomes the standard others unconsciously rise to, and your silence becomes the mirror that reflects their unresolved chaos, forcing them either to elevate or retreat. And without ever raising a voice or seeking an audience, the samurai transforms into someone whose solitude has crafted a presence that cannot be ignored.
By the time the silent samurai reaches this stage, solitude is no longer something he does, it is something he is, because solitude has fused with identity, posture, and decision-making. And this is where the path diverges permanently from ordinary people, because most use silence temporarily as a coping mechanism, a break, or a phase. But the samurai integrates silence into his nervous system until he no longer seeks stimulation to feel alive. And that is the moment freedom truly begins. Because when you no longer need noise to validate existence, no one can manipulate you with it. And this is why most people never reach this stage, because it requires letting go of an addiction they don't even realize they have. The addiction to reaction, to being seen, to being included, to being responded to. And the samurai breaks this addiction slowly and ruthlessly, not by force, but by consistency, by choosing internal alignment over external reassurance again and again until the urge weakens. And what replaces it is something far more stable than happiness, something most people have never experienced long enough to name: inner gravity. A quiet weight to one's presence that does not demand attention, but commands it anyway. And this gravity forms because the samurai has learned to remain centered regardless of outcome: approval, rejection, success, or silence. And that centeredness rewires how the brain evaluates danger, because most fear comes not from circumstances, but from imagined social consequences: loss of status, loss of belonging, loss of approval. And when those fears dissolve, behavior becomes fearless, not in impulse, but in clarity. And this is why silence becomes power at this level, because silence is no longer avoidance, it is discernment, the ability to choose when to speak, when to act, and when to let time do the work. And time always favors the disciplined, because time exposes inconsistency and rewards coherence. And the samurai understands this deeply, which is why he never rushes connection, never rushes explanation, never rushes expression, because rushing leaks energy and reveals insecurity, while patience compresses strength. And this is where the modern world fails catastrophically, because everything trains people to react instantly, respond immediately, share constantly, and perform continuously, creating minds that are loud but weak, visible but shallow, connected but fragile, while the samurai becomes the opposite: quiet but resilient, unseen but formidable, alone but complete. And from this state emerges a new relationship with fear, because fear no longer signals danger, it signals leverage, an area where attachment still exists. And instead of running from fear, the samurai studies it in silence, asking not, "How do I escape this feeling?" but "What attachment is being threatened right now?" And this question alone dissolves most anxiety, because it reframes discomfort as information, not emergency. And this practice compounds over time until emotional storms lose authority, because emotions are allowed but no longer obeyed. And this creates emotional sovereignty, one of the rarest forms of power, the ability to feel deeply without being ruled, to care without clinging, to connect without dependence. And dependence is the true enemy of strength, not loneliness, because dependence traps you into compromise, into seeking permission for peace, while solitude trains you to generate peace independently. And only someone who can generate peace can share it without need. And this is why when people eventually re-enter the samurai's life, they feel something different. They feel safe but not indulged, heard but not enabled, supported but not carried, because the samurai no longer rescues, he reflects. And reflection forces others to confront themselves, which is uncomfortable for those still addicted to noise and validation, but profoundly grounding for those ready to grow. And this is where leadership emerges naturally, not leadership by charisma or dominance, but leadership by coherence. Because coherence is rare, and humans are drawn to stability instinctively, especially in a chaotic world. And the samurai becomes a stabilizing presence simply by remaining aligned. And what most people don't realize is that solitude does not isolate you from the world. It filters who is allowed access to your inner space. And this filter is essential, because unrestricted access leads to fragmentation, while selective access preserves integrity. And integrity is the foundation of trust, both self-trust and external trust. And the samurai trusts himself deeply at this stage, not blindly, but because he has watched himself remain consistent in silence, in doubt, in boredom, and in obscurity, which proves reliability, and reliability builds confidence far stronger than hype ever could. And this confidence is not loud, it does not posture or perform, it simply stands. And when challenges arise, the samurai does not react explosively or withdraw emotionally. He pauses, returns to silence, and lets clarity emerge. And clarity always emerges eventually if you do not contaminate it with panic. And this pause is what separates him from the crowd, because most people respond instantly to avoid discomfort, while the samurai responds intentionally to preserve alignment. And intentional response compounds into a life that feels controlled not by force, but by precision. And as years pass, the rewards of this path appear subtly. Better decisions, cleaner relationships, deeper work, sharper instincts, slower anger, stronger discipline, and a sense of internal safety that does not depend on circumstances. And this safety is the true treasure of the lone samurai path, because it means you can walk through loss, uncertainty, or change without collapsing, without scrambling for validation, without begging life to be easier, because you trust yourself to adapt. And that trust removes fear of the future, because the future no longer feels hostile when you are grounded in yourself. And this is the ultimate irony, that walking alone prepares you to walk with others without losing yourself, while those who never learned solitude disappear inside relationships, crowds, and expectations. And this brings the samurai to a final understanding that reshapes everything. Solitude was never about isolation, it was about authorship, reclaiming ownership of one's mind, emotions, time, and direction. And once authorship is secured, connection becomes voluntary, not compulsory, and love becomes choice, not need. And presence becomes gift, not transaction. And at this point, the silent samurai does not fear being alone ever again, because solitude has taught him how to stand unassisted, how to remain whole without witnesses, and how to move through the world without surrendering himself to it. And this is why silence is power, not because it makes you invisible, but because it makes you unmovable. And from that stillness, everything meaningful flows.